Hi, welcome to Chapter 4 of Readings from Gift of the Shaper. So, if you haven't checked out chapters 1 through 3 already, go back. There's a link in the description with basically the readings from the first 3 chapters. Essentially, this is going to be just a kind of a companion to the book. So, I'm going to read one chapter at a time from the book, kind of point out, what my motivation was for writing the characters, inspiration and stuff, maybe give you some tidbits, like VH1 pop-up video. I'm sure I'm dating myself with that reference, but it's the best I got. So today we're going to be doing Chapter 4. This is told from Thornton's point of view, and it takes place in Derenar, east of Lusk. The 2 horses walked in a line. Jericho was in front pulling the cart, and Matilda followed closely behind with the rest of Mira's flowers. The tiny sliver of a moon above them was doing its best to light their way, but Thornton knew that it would not be enough. He climbed down from the cart and pulled out a torch, sparking his flint until the oil-soaked rag caught fire, lighting up the dusk and the road ahead. Forcing a tight smile, he settled back into his seat to watch the waves of flames make shadows of the trees that lined the path. The light of the torch was welcome, as was the comfort it provided, and he and Mira were back on their way in no time. Lusk was a ways behind them, but Mira still seemed jumpy. Though the road was almost not wide enough for it, she prodded Maddie to the side so she could walk side by side with Thornton and Jericho. "I just don't understand," she started. "Lusk has always been so peaceful." Thornton grunted in agreement. "I've never heard of anything like that happening, especially in a crowded market area," she continued. "And did you see all those people just standing around and watching? It was like nothing was going on." Thornton grunted again, causing Mira to narrow her eyes at him. "Are you listening to me?" she asked. In truth, his head was still back in Lusk. "When I looked at the man lying on the ground," he started, "I saw something. It was a white hand, like a skeleton." Shaking his head, he added, "Can't stop thinking about it." "I saw it too," Mira answered, "and I don't like it." "I don't either," Thornton said as his voice trailed off, allowing silence to settle in. The only other sounds as they traveled were the steady steps of the horses and the wooden creaks of the turning wheels. Their rhythmic repetition had lulled Thornton into complacency as he watched the road ahead of them, lazily scanning the route for anything out of the ordinary. But when he thought he saw a light go out ahead, he instinctively tightened his grip on Jericho's harness. Home was still a ways off, and he was wary. A crunch from somewhere in the trees ahead brought him to a stop, with Mira and Maddie following suit. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Mira nodded. "It sounded like it came from up there," she replied quietly, pointing to the trees off the road ahead. Thornton started to reach into the cart for his hammer, but the sound of a bowstring being drawn made him freeze. "Human, extinguish your light," came a low, gravelly voice. "Don't do it," Mira whispered cautiously. "Listen to me," said the voice. "Why should I?" Thornton shot back. There was silence, followed by a low growl. "You can argue with my arrow, but it flies whether or not you put out the light." Thornton had no choice. With his free hand, he doused the light, and almost instantly the bowstring twanged. An arrow whistled right past him. It must have hit his mark, as a gurgling sound came from behind them, slightly off the road. 2 more arrows flew through the air, and twice more they struck home. This time, a female voice said, "There are more ahead, 5 or 6. Thornton strained his eyes and turned to see where the voices were coming from. He studied the area for a moment and saw nothing. He was about to give up when he heard the low voice of the male again. "Those 3 had been following you for some time. They were about to make their move." Out of the darkness of the trees stepped 2 black figures, barely discernible against the shadows as they approached Mira and Thornton. They were thin and tall, a good foot taller than Thornton, and almost completely invisible in the blackness. As they got closer, Thornton could see why. Their entire bodies were covered in what looked to be fine black fur that caught just the tiniest glint of moonlight. Trailing behind each was a tail about as long as Thornton's arm, and pointed ears sat atop their heads, moving and twitching as they followed sounds. They each held a longbow, and the only clothing they had looked to be made from a single hide. Their dusty and well-worn packs suggested that they had been traveling for some time. "Kinari," Mira whispered, "what are you doing outside of your forest?" So the Kinari were based. They were unfortunately not a completely original idea. We all borrow from someone, as Dan Harmon, writer of Rick and Morty, said it best. But so I took the idea from the movie Avatar, which was an awesome movie, and basically the people from Pandora, the tall, like 9-foot, people, the avatars, basically the Na'vi. Yes, I'm a huge nerd. I wrote a fantasy novel, so I'm not afraid to admit it. But I wanted to, you'll hear a description here in a second of their eyes, and I wanted to kind of make them seem like, I took them from like pit vipers or something. So you'll find out why here in a little while. But that was my inspiration for making the Kinari. So when you picture their eyes, picture like eyes of a snake or like a viper or something like that, like bulbous and black. "The mother told us of your need," said the male. "You are in trouble. We must move." He turned to his companion and said, "Inara, scout ahead. Bring me account." Inara gave a quick nod and melted back into the shadows. Thornton strained his eyes to try and follow her, but it was like she was never even there. He blinked a few times at the vacuous blackness. The male turned to them and bowed slightly. "I'm called Kethris." Despite his narrow frame, nothing about the Kinari suggested frailty. Mira curtsied deeply in return as Thornton looked on, searching in vain for some sign of Inara. "I'm Mira, and this is Thornton," she replied. Kethris walked over to one of the bodies and knelt down to examine it, rolling it onto its back. It was clad in all black, and there was a single white handprint on its shoulder. Mira watched the Kinari closely. "Kethris, what do you mean you're in trouble? How did you find us?" Kethris did not look up from examining the body, but took a dagger and sheath from it and tucked them away in his belt. "We did not find you. We found them. Their pull is strong, and we can feel it from a great distance." He patted down the body a few more times, rifling through pockets, then stood up and sniffed at the air. "Quickly," he said. "Off the road." "What about the horses?" Mira asked. "Bring them," Kethris answered. "They are not safe here either." His attention was focused ahead. He seemed to be looking for something. He turned quickly and motioned for them to follow. Thornton took his hammer from the cart as he and Mira unhooked the horses, leading them off the road to be tethered. The two animals shook their heads excitedly, happy to be rid of the burden. If they noticed Kethris, they didn't show it. The Kinari crouched down, motioning again for Mira and Thornton to follow. The three of them waited in silence for what seemed like an eternity. Then, suddenly, Inara's voice came from behind them. "There are 7, and they are cold." Mira gasped, and Thornton jumped almost out of his skin. They both turned to look at her in amazement. "Cold?" Mira asked the Kinari. "Are they dead?" "No," Inara answered. "They only want to appear as such. They have masked their body heat well, but not well enough." Thornton looked at her quizzically, barely able to make out her face in the moonlight. "I don't understand. Why would they do something like that?" The female Kinari spoke again, saying, "They are waiting for someone, and are very well hidden. But for someone who knows what to look for, they are a beacon in the night." Kethris made a noise from behind them that sounded like laughter. "Inara knows what to look for," he said, smiling, revealing a mouth full of sharp teeth that flashed in the moonlight. Thornton did his best to examine the two Kinari in the dark. Against the blackness, not much stood out. He did note one thing, though. Both of them were as long and thin as tree branches, moving just as they looked, lightly and with ease. Their bearing and gait reminded him of elm trees, long-limbed and lofty, yet sturdy enough to endure even the harshest of storms. Just looking at them was enough to make the hairs stand up on the back of his neck. Inara swept her gaze over Thornton and Mira, regarding both of them coolly. Thornton, closer to her now, studied her face and felt his heart jump when he realized what was so unnerving. It was her eyes. They were 3 times the size of Thornton's and did not reflect even the tiniest bit of light. It was like looking into pools of black. Before Thornton had time to say anything, Kethra stood and said, "Move." Mira hesitated, saying, "The horses." But Inara took her by the arm and said, "Leave them. We will return." Thornton followed, gripping his hammer and bringing up the rear in silence. The 2 Kinari were masters of their craft. Kethris had taken to the trees, leaping effortlessly to a branch, catching it, and swinging upwards in one fluid motion without making so much as a sound. Inara kept to the ground, acting as a guide for Mira and Thornton. She quietly pointed out twigs and dead leaves on her way so they could avoid stepping on them. Thornton had still not completely made up his mind about the 2 creatures from the shadows. Mira seemed surprised to see them, but not incredulous, as Thornton most certainly was. He'd heard stories, but only ever thought of them as just that, stories. When his father spoke of them, it was in the same way as he spoke of one day growing rich and fat, nothing more than something to let the mind wander. But here were 2 of them, standing right in front of him, like shadows come to life from the forest. 2 predators, perfectly suited for hunting at night, something they had grown to master over the years as it was their sole means of survival. They were creatures of stealth and silence, stalking prey, and they did it better than any other living thing. The sounds of low chatter could be heard from up ahead as they approached. Thornton looked to the trees for some sign of Kethris, but found none, not even a telltale movement of a branch or rustle of leaves. Inara put up her hand, motioning for them to stop. She turned to Thornton. "These men are prepared to kill you," she whispered. "You must not let them. Have you ever taken a life?" "No," Thornton whispered. He did not look at her face as she spoke. He was still not used to it. Mira was silent. Inara pulled out a dagger from a sheath around her leg and handed it to Mira, saying to both of them, "The first one is the hardest, but never forget, any one of them will take your life if you give them the chance." Mira nodded but did not speak. Thornton gripped his hammer uneasily, tapping his fingers quietly on the handle as he adjusted the grip. The worn ash felt familiar and comforting as he found himself wishing he were back home working the forge instead. Since there was no fire to give them away, Thornton heard the group of men long before he could see them as the Kinari continued to lead their silent advance. Thornton strained his eyes in the dark but could only make out the faintest trace of shapes. He had no idea how Inara could be so confident in her count, but he imagined it had something to do with those eyes of hers. He shuddered when he pictured them again. Inara took a stick from nearby and started drawing in the dirt. She made 7 circles in the ground and 4 X's. 1 X, Kethris, Thornton guessed, lay behind the group of circles. 2 X's were front and center, Mira and he, and the 4th X was behind those by a good distance. Inara spoke, addressing both of them. "You must meet them head on. You have the element of surprise on your side, so you can almost even our number with 2 swift blows. They will not expect you to act so quickly, and their defenses will be down. If you are swift enough, perhaps you can put 1 or 2 of them on the ground." She rubbed her hand over 3 of the circles, leaving 4. Thornton spoke up. "You make it sound like it's just the 2 of us. Where will you be?" Inara made a low gurgling sound like laughter. "The Kinari are hunters, not creatures of brute force. Our strength lies in stealth and distance. We will strike from the trees, so they can never be sure if there is 1 or 100. Standing, she added, "But I assure you, we will be with you." Thornton was quiet, but nodded his approval. "When I give the signal, you 2 will charge, swiftly as you can. Kethris and I will do the rest." She paused and looked up. "Above all else, you must not hesitate. If you do, even my truest arrow cannot help you." She looked past the group of men to something unseen. "He's ready. Move!" They approached the small clearing where the 7 lay in wait. They were sitting in a loose circle with 2 of them facing the road as lookouts. Thornton could feel his palms sweating as he tightened his grip on the hammer. All his years of swinging it could not prepare him for this, he knew, hoping that he would be able to swing it when it truly mattered. He looked over at Mira, who seemed not to notice, like her mind was somewhere else. From behind them, Inara whispered, "Now!" and the two of them were off, running headlong into danger. Thornton had the longest reach with his hammer. By the time he landed the first blow with a deep thud to the head of his target, the others were on their feet. 1 down, 6 to go, he thought coldly. Reason and guilt were shut out as he opened himself up to instinct and the knowledge that these men would do the same to him, if not worse, given the chance. His heart raced as he tried to ignore the sick feeling creeping up in his throat. Thornton ducked as a sword swung at him from the left and heard the sound of Mira's dagger going into the chest of a man to his right. 2 down, 5 left. He thrust forward with the head of his hammer, ramming it into the stomach of someone coming toward him. A whisper of arrows came from behind him as he heard them hit their mark. 2 thuds, 2 more down. 3 left. Sidestepping a slice from his left, he was not quick enough to dodge a second time as the follow-up slice caught him on the arm, shooting pain throughout his body. Adrenaline surging, he shrugged it off, slamming the butt end of his hammer into the face of his attacker. He dodged another slash, but caught a kick to the ribs that sent him reeling back and off balance. He regained his footing long enough to swing his hammer down and catch the assailant in the forearm, splintering bone and dropping the man to his knees, screaming. An arrow from Kethris finished the job, leaving just 2 men standing side by side, staring at Thornton through the dark. No one moved a muscle. In the dim moonlight, the dark clothing the men wore did a good job of obscuring them against the blackness of the night. Thornton tried to make out their faces, but they were nothing but outlines to him, 2 dim shapes in the darkness. But their eyes gave off a blood-red glow, flaring up and dying down like coals in a fire. Thornton was mesmerized as he watched them, glowing and dimming, up and down, rhythmic like breathing. An eternity of silence passed as he stared them down, waiting for them to make a move or a sound, all the while feeling drawn to the lights behind their eyes. He adjusted the grip on his hammer, tightening his fingers around the white ash handle. Then, in an instant, the night was illuminated with red as the darkness gave way to a sickening glow, revealing a third figure standing behind them, most of his face covered by a black hood. He flashed a smile that sent a shiver down Thornton's spine. "Kith!" came the frantic cry from Inara. "They are Kith! Get back!" She followed the words with an arrow, but the hooded figure was quicker. He raised his hand, and the earth itself seemed to fly up to meet it, shattering the arrow into 1,000 pieces and splintering it harmlessly onto the ground. The 2 figures in front looked like fire as Thornton watched them pulse with burning power. Neither so much as flinched. The Kith in the back doffed his hood to reveal a scarred and burnt face that reminded Thornton of the man who had bought the chains. Inara growled as she revealed herself, stepping forward from the shadows. "So it was you 3 we felt," she said. "You hid yourself well, servants of the Breaker." So the Kith were one of the basically like race of magic users that I came up with. The other obviously being the Athrani. We haven't met them yet, but if you've read the book, which I'm going off the assumption that you did, spoiler alert, the Athrani are the other kind of race of magic users. So the Kith actually started out as there was like one leader, and I had written like servants. These 2 other guys were servants, basically like another kind of magical entity that the Kith had summoned. But eventually, as I started writing the book, I got further and deeper into it. It actually worked out a little better to have them all be Kith and to have that as like another aspect of their character, of what they kind of go through as they experience the breaking. Obviously something that again you'll read about later in the book, but So I actually went back and rewrote this chapter as the Kith, all three of them basically being these creatures that could, transform their bodies into this like fiery, horrifying creature. So the Kith made no sounds as the one in back moved the palm of his hands to the ground, which began to tremble in anticipation. He flicked one hand toward the sky, and the earth cracked and split around them in a circle. Then Thornton watched as three Kith were raised into the air by a simple gesture that seemed to have summoned a mountain out of nothing. Rumbling and shaking, the earth leapt upward, shedding boulders and dirt as it grew. When it finally stopped, the Kith were as high as some of the surrounding trees, staring down at Thornton and Mira like hawks eyeing a group of field mice. "Go," said the hooded one, as the other two seemed to disappear in a flicker of flame. Moving swiftly off the earthen platform and suddenly reappearing in front of Thornton, their eyes burning wildly. "Look out!" Mira shouted. She had drawn her dagger and was running toward them. Thornton stumbled back in a panic as the Kith closest to him lunged with both hands, sending him tumbling onto his back with a thud. He rolled to his right to escape a boot that barely missed crushing his skull. Then, coming quickly to a knee, he swiveled his head to see Mira caught up with fending off the second one. It was using the earth to ward off Inara's arrows and was moving like the feat was effortless. Thornton looked back up to the figure before him and stared right into its fiery eyes, flames moving around it like water. It seemed to be made of flesh, but was burnt and split, making it appear more like charred wood than skin. Cracks on the surface glowed orange like the embers of a log in a fire. Thornton took to his feet and regained his balance just in time to sidestep a fist from the ashen figure. He countered with a punch of his own from his offhand, but when his fist connected, it felt like he had hit a block of pure granite. He pulled back his stinging knuckles and stared wide-eyed at the Kith before him, who bared his teeth in what might have passed for a smile. A swift backhand sent Thornton flying. To his dazed and blurry vision, it looked like three of them were bearing down on him, and he struggled to his feet to try and defend himself. In a heave of desperation, he swung his hammer blindly, cursing aloud as it felt like he'd hit nothing but air. He clenched his teeth and braced for the impact from the counterattack. When it didn't come, he opened his eyes to find nothing before him but a pile of ash. A roar of pain erupted from the Kith above, who still stood atop the rocky peak. Looking suspiciously at his hammer, Thornton turned his head again to Mira. The Kith pursuing her had a dagger sticking out of his side and was swatting down arrows like flies. Thornton could see that Mira was empty-handed and defenseless, with nothing but a look of defiance masking her fear. Her fists, hanging loosely at her sides, were bloody from taking swings at the fiery figure. So I had Mira is basically like an amalgamation of two of my ex-girlfriends. I tend to write characters based off people I know. The reason for that is, I can sort of see how they would react in any given situation. I listen to what their dialogue would sound like, how they speak, their mannerisms and stuff like that. When I write, it's a lot of viewing the story in my head, kind of like, viewing a movie, and I watch the scene unfold and try and write it down as well as I can. So I wanted Mira to be feisty. I didn't want her to be this helpless, stereotypical princess who always needs saving. Mira is far from that. Mira is not a princess who needs saving. She's a fighter. She can hold her own, believe it or not, for a woman who collects flowers. Mira is pretty much the furthest thing from, the helpless damsel in distress. So this scene right here, I think I really tried to capture that, that she's not just laying down and rolling over. Her fists are bloody. She's sunk a dagger into this Kith's back, and she's fighting for her life. So Mira was continuing to back away from the creature, and the blood from her knuckles was welling up enough to drip onto the ground. Thornton had his hammer in his right hand as he ran, grasping it about halfway down, its head to the ground and handle to the sky. He placed his left hand at the end of the handle as he covered the last remaining steps between himself and the kith. Leaping, he raised it above his head as the creature made a lunge toward Mira, oblivious to the threat behind it. To Thornton, the scene seemed to unfold in slow motion. The head of his hammer was the first to make contact as it caught the creature on the crown of its skull. Thornton had the same feeling as before when he felt like he was swinging through air. He followed through as the heavy black metal cut through the creature in a downward arc, meeting no resistance and splitting the creature in half without so much as a sound. He swung so hard that the head of his hammer buried itself in the ground, standing on its own as Thornton released his grip on the handle and backed away. He watched as the creature stood there, two halves of what moments ago was a whole, frozen in mid-stride and still reaching for Mira. The black, charred skin of the creature revealed a fiery orange where it was split in half, running in an almost straight line from the top of its head to just above the waist where it tapered off to the left. It stood there motionless, as if it were unaware of what had happened. Then, in just enough time for Thornton to blink, the creature crumbled into a pile of ash. Dumbfounded, Thornton looked to his hands for an explanation. Finding none, he reached out for his hammer again, letting his palm settle on the worn wood of the handle. It felt warm to the touch, like leather on a hot day, and the warmth spread throughout him as he held it. When a second cry of pain came from the last remaining kith, he picked it up and readied himself to strike again. As he did, Inara stepped in front of Mira and him. She looked up at the kith, who towered above her, and spoke. "You are an abomination, kith, you and all your kind." The creature coughed, sending a spatter of blood onto the earth in front of him. He glared down at Inara. "The Breaker of the Dawn is coming to break this world and restore us to greatness." He turned his eyes to Mira, who gasped audibly and took a step back. Extending a finger toward her, his eyes darkened and he said, "Blood of the Shaper, you will be the one to free him." Thornton stood firm even as the ground beneath him trembled. He knew this was his chance, while the kith was distracted. He looked at the base of the rocky platform and made a break for it, swinging his hammer as hard as he could. He connected and felt the earth shudder, sending huge chunks of rock spraying off. A surprised cry from the kith filled his ears as he swung again, this time cleaving the platform in half to collapse under its own weight. His foundation destroyed, the black-hooded creature fell helplessly along with it, landing sharply on the pile of rocks and dirt. Lying on his back, his eyes focused on Thornton. He opened his mouth to speak, but death found him first. An arrow fired from the bow of Kethris, still hidden, buried itself solidly in his throat. The kith made a choking sound as he grasped at the arrow and tried to pull it out, but it did him no good. The last of his breath left him in a sputter as he stared wide-eyed at the handle of Thornton's hammer. "He is dead," Kethris said, stepping out from the shadows. Thornton stared at the black-robed figure lying on the ground in front of him. He approached him cautiously, stooping to examine the body. He did not need the moonlight to see the huge white hand woven into the back of his robe. "But what is he?" he asked. "The kith," Kethris answered, "serve the Breaker of the Dawn. They are blood enemies of the Athrani, and are a threat to all who would see the Breaker remain imprisoned." Thornton knew enough about the Athrani to realize that an enemy of theirs was someone to be feared. He'd heard about them from his father, but only that they were powerful and dangerous. "How is he able to do that?" Thornton asked. "Move the earth like that?" "Breaking, they call it," the Kinari answered slowly, as if the word itself were dangerous. "They harness the energy that exists beyond this world and use it to their own ends. And although they are not as powerful as they once were, they are still formidable." Thornton's attention was still focused on the kith's robe. "This white hand, I've seen it before. Mira and I were attacked earlier today, and I saw it on the cloak of one of the men." Kethris nodded. "The hand of the Black Dawn.
It is a symbol for all of those who are sworn in service to the Breaker.
I don't know what they want, Thornton said, but it can't be a coincidence that we keep running into them. Mira still looked shaken up. What did he mean by blood of the Shaper? Kethris approached, examining her from a distance.
I was hoping you could tell us.
She looked at the ground as if a painful memory had somehow made its way back into her mind. She shook her head and was silent.
Inara spoke suddenly. We should leave. There may be more, and I am not one for being hunted.
What about the bodies? Thornton asked.
The forest will take them.
Thornton backed away, suddenly realizing that unnamed dangers could still be lurking in the darkness. The four of them made their way back onto the road, and Kethris led them back to their horses, which had not moved from where they had left them. Thornton scratched Jericho behind the ears, and the big brown horse flicked his tail with satisfaction. He started to hook up the cart when Kethris put his hand on his shoulder.
It will only slow us down.
Thornton looked at him, puzzled. But I need to bring it back to my father.
Kethris shook his head. You cannot go back. Whoever sent these men has surely sent more. You said yourself that you recognized the symbol on their clothing. You are not safe anymore, and you would only be endangering those around you, including your father.
I don't understand. What do they want with me?
Do you really want to find out?
Kethris said, turning to face the forest and listen. Thornton put down the cart's hitch. Not from them.
Agreed, Kethris said.
But who else would know? Mira asked as she took out Matilda's saddle from her cart.
Perhaps our mother can help, Kethris answered. There is a road ahead that will take us north to Kienar.
He pointed to the blankets in Thornton's and Mira's carts.
There are no beds on the road we will take. Bring those. We have long to travel.
Thornton looked at Jericho and the blanket in his cart and thought of home. I have to see my father one last time. Kethris looked at him, considering, thrumming his long black fingers on his chin in thought. Glancing down the road toward Lusk and the other way towards Thornton's village, he said,
You will place him in great danger. It is still possible that he will be left alone. I do not know what draws the men of the Hand to you, but if you go back there, you could lead them right to him.
Thornton looked at the ground in disappointment and back to Jericho. The tall workhorse buried the end of his nose in Thornton's palm, bringing the slightest crack of a smile to Thornton's lips. He scratched behind Jericho's ear and worked his hand through his gray-flecked mane. I just need to see him, at least to tell him that I'll be taking Jericho. He loves this old horse, maybe more than me. Jericho snorted in apparent protest.
We have no time for tearful goodbyes, Kethris said sharply.
The words made Mira laugh. You don't know Olson Woods, she said. The last time he cried, Lusk was just an inn. Kethris eyed her and Thornton carefully.
Very well, he replied. But quickly, we have no time.
Thornton looked at Mira, whose face reflected her uncertainty. He took the blanket and pouch of coins from his cart, taking a moment to prepare Jericho's saddle, and climbed on, urging him forward. Mira, exasperated, did the same with Matilda. So there you go. There is Chapter 4 of Gift of the Shaper. Hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, if you haven't checked out chapters 1 through 3, I'll have the link below. Chapter 1, I'll have the link below. Maybe I'll put up 2 or 3 if I feel like it. But there's a lot of chapters here, so I'll figure it out. But like I said, so we met Kethris and Inara, the two Kinari. Obviously, we know Thornton and Mira. And now they are back, headed on their way back to Highglade. And Thornton is going to say hello to his father, Olson. So if you liked this, like I said, check out the other videos. And if you don't have Gift of the Shaper already, you can pick it up on Amazon. Just a quick search under d.l.jennings or Gift of the Shaper. I'm pretty sure it's going to be one of the first results now. So making some serious progress there. But like I said, check it out. If you have any comments or anything like that, anything in the format you'd like to see, feel free to comment below. And I'll see you guys next time.